You're listening to the ESP, the European Skeptics Podcast, an independent weekly show set out to bring you news, interesting topics and interviews with people mostly from Europe, building bridges and breaking down language barriers to show the world how active and awesome the skeptical movement is in the region. This is episode 516. I'm your host, András Pinter, and joining me for the show is my co-host, Pontus Böckman. See ya!
Hejsan, András! Welcome back home.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be back.
It's
for
good
a
to
week.
Be back.
For a week, that is.
For a week only. Oh boy.
Yeah.
So how's the snow situation? We talked about snow a couple of weeks ago.
The snow situation is gone.
It's gone.
It's basically completely gone.
Okay. Yeah, because we had, yesterday evening, we had a new snow thingy. So we now have about 10, 12 centimeters of snow again.
Ooh, that is good.
Well, yeah.
I
guess if
I mean, I love snow. So actually, I was just listening to Adrian Hill on the Skeptic Zone, and she was talking about how cold Alberta is, and it's snowy and all that. I want to be there. I've never seen Canada in winter.
You've been there several times, right?
Yeah, I've been there many times, but only in summer, and that is really something that is on my bucket list to see Canada in winter. Or Siberia, but I'm not sure I want to.
Well, that sounds like more like a punishment, right? You go to Siberia to be punished.
Yeah, actually, I don't think there's much of a difference between Siberia and the north of Canada when it comes to the weather. So it's and the environment and the circumstances. It's just I think we have a connotation that comes with Siberia that is very bad, and it has a lot to do with Russia and formerly the Russian Empire that actually used that place for
the Soviet Union
to send people on the Gulag and all that.
So we don't know what we're talking about. So maybe we should
exactly. So this is one of the reasons why we should experience it firsthand. Yeah. But one thing is for sure, because we have seen, I'm sure that you have seen them too. Kamchatka has gotten a shitload of snow recently. But photos have been circulating online that are absolutely unrealistic, and they have been proven to be fake. So like massive blocks of flats covered in snow for 5 stories high. And this is just unrealistic. Wow. And they are not real. And a lot of people fell for them. So tomorrow, as of this recording, I am giving a talk on disinformation. And the consequences of that and how we should try and avoid falling for them.
In what context to whom are you speaking?
It is a local charity that organizes these talks on all kinds of different topics. So I was invited to give a talk as the head of the Hungarian Skeptics. Mostly, well, it's a charity for supporting young people. All sorts of educational stuff that they're into, and those projects they are running are very cool. And I'm involved with a lot of them, including one yearly event that is a bit of a poetry-focused event for children. It's a bit of a competition about how well they know the works and the life of the most highly esteemed Hungarian poet named Attila József. And I've been involved with that for
I think you've mentioned it
more
before.
than a decade. Yeah.
Right.
I love poetry, and he's my all-time favorite among Hungarian poets. There you go. Yeah. But I wanted to talk about something and just get it off my chest. You've probably been following what's happening in Davos, right, in Switzerland.
Yeah, I've actually tried to avoid it because it's such a shit show.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd like to say to our listeners from the United States that we really, really feel for you and feel your pain for being exposed to the idiot in chief who tries to damage everything that humanity has built up in the last 80 years or so, and probably not even realizing that he's doing that. That's the level he's at. I'd especially like to tell our Canadian listeners how enthusiastic I am about what your Prime Minister said And I think you have every reason to be proud of being Canadian at the moment. So the world is looking at you for leadership at the moment, apparently. And I really like how some of the European leaders have used this opportunity. And in the last couple of months, in the last year or so, since Trump got into power again for the second fucking time, so some of the European leaders have been raising their profile. And I like to see that. And how at the World Economic Forum, European leaders seem to have stood up against the bullying coming from the President of the United States. That made me proud of that as well. Nobody gave the talk that Mark Carney did, so that was just mind-blowing. How clear the vision is, how important those words were. But I really enjoy seeing the rise of European politics on the world level.
Yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see.
We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see how it ends. I don't know.
We have our job to do here in Hungary.
Yeah.
In April to get rid of the current government.
Yes, do that,
that is
please.
hindering that process for the Hungarians, because we do want to be part of what's going on in Europe right now. That kind of collaboration, cooperation, hopefully becoming stronger. And you can see that even right-wing populist leaders seem to have come to their senses to some extent.
Well,
and that is good to see.
When it comes to Trump, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
But not the other ones.
So, yeah, exactly. But still, even they seem to have said that enough is enough. So there is a certain level of normalcy that we would still like to see. When Nigel fucking Farage says that Trump is wrong, there is something off with the whole fabric of the world. So... yeah, in a way, it might end up being the good kind of wake-up call that all the world needed.
I think a lot of it is bad, of course, and it would have been better if it didn't happen, but there can be some positive things maybe coming out of this. Maybe.
Yeah, and it might be just wishful thinking on my part.
I
said what I said.
I'm not quite as positive as you sound, but anyway, let's hope you're right.
Okay, we'll see.
All right.
We'll see.
Yeah, I have a short follow-up from last week's Really Right Award, which we gave to the Faculty of Law at Lund University for speaking up against the suggested toughening on crime, quote-unquote, that we are seeing here in Sweden. And if you missed that, all Swedish political parties are suggesting harder sentences and lowering the age of criminal responsibility, even down to 13 years of age. So locking up children, basically. And as I said last week, experts in criminology say that that is not just ethically problematic, it also doesn't work. It's counterproductive. And as they said, quote from last week, lowering the age of criminal responsibility is now, quote, a well-tried method that doesn't work, end quote. So I think that's pretty thing. But the follow-up is that the head of the Swedish Bar Association, so the lawyers in Sweden, and her name is Mia Edvall Insulander. I guess that's a mouthful for people who are not Swedish. But she's now joining in, and she's very critical as well of this suggestion. And this is what she had to say. Quote, this is a proposal that contravenes both the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child's recommendations on how children should be treated. It's a kind of experiment on children, which is unacceptable based on existing research on how children are affected by punishment, end quote. So, yeah, here. More people are speaking up against this. But if nothing happens, the age of responsibility for criminal responsibility will be lowered to 13 years of age on the 1st of June, I think. Or maybe it's 1st of June or 1st of July this year. Crazy.
Is there a way for that to be overturned based on... I mean, there might be some points in that go against European law.
Could be, maybe, but then you have to appeal to some EU court and stuff, and that takes ages. Yeah. Years. And you have to have somebody who has the standing to do that as well, legal standing to do so. I don't know how it works, to be honest, but...
and plus, we don't know if there is any EU law that it goes against.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No.
There might
There
not
should
be.
be, but
Yeah. We are calling for more European integration there. Please work it out, people. Yes, but everyone has to do their part. So we are doing our part in providing the content for our listeners. So let's turn to the regular part of the show, the first of which is This Week in Skeptical History, also known as TWISH. This week, we're marking the birthday of a man whose biography reads like someone took a respected scientist of the Enlightenment, hit him with a spiritual sledgehammer at the age of 55, and watched his entire life and philosophy take a U-turn.
yes.
Not for the best. And that man is Emanuel Swedenborg.
Very well pronounced. Yes.
Thank you.
Swedish
who was
guy.
born on the 29th of January 1688 in Stockholm. And for the first 2/3 of his life, he was exactly the kind of person skeptics love to claim as one of our own. So before we get anywhere near angels, heaven, or conversations with the dead, and yes, we will get there, let's be clear about who Swedenborg actually was. Because he was not a fringe mystic lurking on the margins of society. He was a serious, accomplished polymath of the Enlightenment. After graduating from Uppsala University at the young age of 21, Swedenborg went on a gap year. That actually lasted 4 years, but who counts? And he embarked on a European study tour that involved things like studying astronomy with John Flamsteed, the then Astronomy Royal in England, exchanging ideas in circles influenced by Isaac Newton, and keeping up with figures like Edmund Halley. So, well, it's not your average gap year that lasts for 4 years. But anyhow, back in Sweden, Swedenborg got himself a prestigious government position after that at the Board of Mines, which was pretty central to the Swedish economy of the age. He worked closely with Christopher Polham, who I understand is often described as Sweden's father of engineering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's pretty famous. We have schools named after him, etc. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that was also an indicator of how important a person he was and how high esteem he had. Swedenborg published Sweden's first algebra textbook. He founded the country's first scientific journal. He designed canals and docks. He even proposed submarines and flying machines. Well, they remained on paper, but
well, we're still working on them. We're still working on them. We have to refine his design a little bit. But.
Yeah, but his canals and docks and elevating machines and all that, they were working machines. They were actually designed by him. And he also wrote extensively on metallurgy. So he was considered one of the greatest experts on metallurgy of the time, actually. So his 1734 Opera Philosophica et Mineralia was one of the most comprehensive scientific papers on mining and metal production of its time. He was quite a man. He also made strikingly modern contributions to biology and neuroscience, suggesting, for example, well ahead of others of this time, that different mental functions are localized in different regions of the brain. How cool is that? And almost as a side project, Swedenborg developed an early version of what we now call the nebular hypothesis as well, because he was into astronomy too. This is the idea that planets form from cosmic matter.
Wow.
Did he do that? He beat Emanuel Kant to it by roughly 20 years. This really matters, because when historians say Swedenborg was brilliant and a freaking genius, they're not being hyperbolic about it. He genuinely was. But, and this is a big, big but there. Well, I don't know how big a but he had, but anyhow, his early 50s, something definitely went wrong. I mean, from a skeptical perspective, at least. Not from his perspective, because he didn't see anything going wrong. But more on that later. So, 1743, at age 55, Swedenborg set out on another European journey. And what followed is documented in a remarkable source known as the Journal of Dreams that he kept, between 1743 and 1744. He was very meticulous about his journals, by the way. So this is how we know about all his designs and everything, because he wrote down all his thoughts and ideas. That was pretty cool, because historians can actually work out everything and the transition of his way of thinking as well, which resulted in the things that I'm about to tell you. So it begins innocently enough, the Journal of Dreams, because it's about travel notes, reflections, observations. But then, at some point, it changes abruptly and rather unsettlingly. The journal transforms into something far darker than it used to be. It depicts a man in acute psychological crisis. The journal records vivid dreams, waking visions, intense anxiety, and a crushing sense of guilt. Not guilt about moral failings, but about intellectual pride that he had in his work. Swedenborg feared he had been driven by ambition, by the desire for scientific greatness rather than humility. And it seems to have given him a sense of guilt that had to be resolved in some way. He starts describing encounters with what he believed were evil spirits, fear of suffocation, and experiences that today would raise immediate clinical eyebrows. He reports things that look like hallucinations. The medical establishment would later make an attempt at explaining all this. In the 19th century, for example, a psychiatrist named Maudsley examined the historical record and diagnosed Swedenborg with acute mania in the period between 1743 and 44, which was followed by chronic mania for the rest of his life. Other scholars have suggested schizophrenia. Some have speculated temporal lobe epilepsy. The man clearly experienced something, some intense psychological distress, which is evident from the record, but what precisely? We don't know. But then came the turning point for him and for his mindset. Over Easter weekend in April 1744, Swedenborg reported a vision of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And for him, this was not just another experience, it was an explanation. It was some kind of a relief in the form of a revelation. The turmoil, the guilt, the sense that his scientific achievements were spiritually hollow suddenly made sense. God, he believed, was calling him to a new mission. And by 1745, Swedenborg was convinced he had been divinely instructed to abandon natural philosophy entirely and devote himself to theology. In 1747, he was offered a promotion at his government post, which he declined and resigned subsequently. So, at age 59, after 4 decades as one of Europe's leading scientific minds, Emanuel Swedenborg reinvented himself as, and there's really no better term, a professional mystic. And his followers, because he had a lot of followers actually, they ended up establishing something that is called the New Church. It's also referred to as Swedenborgism. So it's like a restorationist denomination of Christianity, but founded like at least 10 years after his death. The last 25 years of his life, Swedenborg lived what he described as conscious access to the spiritual world. He claimed he could converse with angels and departed spirits as easily as we chat with the person next to us. He said Jesus Christ was dictating theology to him directly. And so he wrote and wrote and wrote some 30 volumes of books, all in Latin, most published anonymously. Some of them were only recovered and identified as his with later studies. So he produced detailed descriptions of heaven and hell. He developed an elaborate theology based on the doctrine of correspondences, the idea that everything material has a spiritual equivalent, and the Bible is essentially a code for deciphering spiritual realities. So that's pretty crazy if you think about it, especially for someone who used to be one of the greatest scientific minds. And he claimed that the biblical stories of Genesis aren't history, they're spiritual allegories. Egypt represents earthly knowledge. The patriarchs represent stages of spiritual development. Yeah, that is some weird shit there. And here's the crucial skeptical point. Swedenborg did not abandon reason completely. He kind of redirected it. His logic remained rigorous in a way, but his highest form of evidence seemed to have become personal revelation rather than experimental data. His visions were not hypotheses to be tested, they were axioms to be accepted. And this is how a sharp analytical mind can continue to reason flawlessly once the foundations themselves are no longer open to correction. But there is one more thing. The episode that made even skeptics pause. You probably know about, from history, the Great Stockholm Fire, right?
Mm-hmm.
In 1759, Sweden experienced that fire on July the 19th. A fire broke out and burned through Södermalm, destroying about 300 houses and rendering 2,000 people homeless. It was catastrophic. Swedenborg was 400 kilometers away in Gothenburg, attending a dinner party with a friend named William Castell. And according to multiple eyewitness accounts, which became part of historical record, Swedenborg suddenly became agitated. He excused himself repeatedly, pacing, sweating. When asked what was wrong, he described in vivid detail a massive fire breaking out in Stockholm, not just any fire, a fire in his neighborhood. He said it had already consumed multiple buildings, was threatening his own house, and was spreading through Södermalm. Later that evening, Swedenborg announced that the fire had been stopped. It stopped, he said, 3 buildings from his own home, exactly as it had indeed stopped in reality. And about the timing, the fire had burned itself out early on the morning of July 20th. So this became obviously famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, as evidence of clairvoyance. Even Immanuel Kant, the apotheosis of Enlightenment rationality, was intrigued enough to investigate it. In 1763, Kant had his friend Joseph Green interview eyewitnesses in both Gothenburg and Stockholm, and when Kant reported his findings, he concluded, and I quote, that the evidence places the assertion respecting Swedenborg's extraordinary gift beyond all possibility of doubt. That's not a skeptic saying maybe there's something here. That's Kant effectively saying, I cannot explain this away. So that's pretty extraordinary. This doesn't mean Swedenborg's theological claims are true. It doesn't validate his visions, but it does illustrate something fascinating, that even the greatest mind of the age of reason couldn't completely dismiss him. So the question remains, what do we make of Swedenborg? Was he mad? Was he visionary? Was his 1744 crisis a psychotic break or a genuine spiritual transformation? Did he have genuine access to the spiritual world, or did he experience a complex neurological or psychological event that he interpreted through the only available framework, which was his religious mysticism? The honest answer is, we don't know. And that's actually interesting, in my opinion. Unlike many historical figures making grand spiritual claims, Swedenborg's evidence is sufficiently peculiar, the fire incident being the most famous example of that. Dismissing him out of hand feels intellectually lazy, but it's extraordinary enough that us skeptics cannot just simply accept it either. So we want explanations, but it's going to be impossible, even though the stories, they are written all over the place. So what we can say is that he was a brilliant man who experienced something profound, something he couldn't reconcile with his scientific worldview, and he reorganized his entire existence around understanding that. Whether that was genius, madness, or something genuinely inexplicable remains ambiguous, but that ambiguity perhaps is the most honest conclusion that we can reach. About Emanuel Swedenborg, who was born on the 29th of January, 1688.
Yeah. Interesting. Sometimes the line between genius and madness is very thin.
I've been wondering how much of a household name he is in Sweden.
No, we don't talk about him daily, But he's a name that you hear about in school. I couldn't have told you all what you told me now. I didn't know about the supposed clairvoyance with the fire. I hadn't heard about that. I knew he was a mystic. I also knew he did a lot of brilliant things for science, but that was the extent of my knowledge.
Yeah, and I think one of the reactions that we could easily slip into as skeptics is once we hear about his transformation into a mystic, we start dismissing some of the things that he had achieved previously. But this is a mistake. And this is why I'm really happy to hear that his real achievements are taught and talked about and remembered alongside what he ended up doing in the end. So that's pretty good.
I think he had a revival or belief in his mysticism was revived a little bit at the end of the 1800s. There were some famous authors and others who looked into that and thought they found something very interesting in that side of him.
Yeah, and he seems to have been interesting enough so that people of the 19th and 20th century, well, especially from the field of psychiatry, try to explain all his mental states. But
that's, you shouldn't try. Even a professional psychiatrist shouldn't really try to diagnose somebody from afar, especially when there's a couple of hundred years in between. You should be very careful.
I think it does have medical relevance, and it does have merit that people do try that. Obviously, we cannot say with any certainty anything about that. But that is a little bit like scientific fields like evolutionary psychology, which is a thing in and of itself. Obviously, a person like him is an interesting study material for psychiatrists and psychologists because it's well documented. And that is the interesting part of it. And I mentioned earlier Attila József, the poet, and it's still unclear whether he committed suicide or it was an accident that he fell under a train and died at the age of 32. But he definitely had a lot of psychiatric issues. He went through several sessions of therapy for long periods of time, and basically every psychologist and psychiatrist gave up on him. And it's still an interesting matter of discussion, and it's a very interesting topic. We will never know for sure what he actually had. So a clear diagnosis is impossible, but it's still interesting to look into it and try to identify what went through his mind. Anyhow, moving on from This Week in Skeptical History to the news.
Yeah, so the effects of war, of course, are horrible and terrible, destroying people's lives, leveling whole communities to the ground, literally in some cases. Yeah. And in addition to these very visible tragedies, it also takes a hard toll on truth and facts and even people's sanity sometimes. In cases of uncertainty and chaos, people turn to fiction for comfort. And when I say fiction, I of course mean religion. But dictators don't care. In fact, they often encourage misinformation of any kind because populations who know what's going on are harder to control. So, Putin has not hesitated to use religion as an ally in what he's doing against Ukraine and also against his own people. Maybe he even is a believer himself on some level in religion. We don't know that, of course. But he doesn't seem to be very big on humility and forgiveness, things that should be very central to a Christian person. Anyway, one thing that Putin did, and I don't remember if we've covered that on the show, but in 2022, he had himself be appointed as chief exorcist by the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, I'm sure his best buddy, Patriarch Kirill, had a lot to do with that. That came as a reaction to when Putin had his rhetoric about de-Satanizing Ukraine. Yeah. Because why the hell not? Yeah. But exorcism, that's interesting because it doesn't have a long tradition in the Russian Orthodox Church, as my understanding is. as communist ideology dissipated when the Soviet Union fell, underground religious groups flourished and the Orthodox Church was revived. But it's not just them, it was also hypnotists and self-proclaimed psychic healers became very prominent, even on television. There were both a religious revival and a lot of occult experimentation, which included exorcism. And this is where we were going now. For nearly 2 decades, there was a popular television show called Battle of the Psychics in Russia. That show encouraged belief in supposed paranormal abilities and self-proclaimed healers, witches and mediums, things like that. And one of the later episodes even featured a live exorcism. But what's happening now is that exorcisms are growing into a big business in Russia. The church is advertising organized trips to well-known exorcism destinations, quote unquote, such as the Oryol Oblast, which is 400 kilometers south of Moscow, where Father Igor is the big name.
Obviously.
Yes. And the cost just to apply for exorcism is between 10,000 and 20,000 rubles. And that's about 110 to 220 euros. And if I understand this correctly, that's around 15 to 25% of the median salary in Russia. So that's quite a lot of money.
And imagine that in a country that the economy of which is devastated by completely being switched to used for the war effort. So it's like...
And so this fee is only for the application. I don't know what they charge for the actual exorcism if you get approved. And you have to do that, you have to be approved by church officials, they say. Or at least the Russian Orthodox Church warns that exorcism attempts must be left to members of the clergy. Well, of course, we don't want to let amateurs steal our business. And they even recruit from outside of Russia. One example is a trip that you can book from Belarus to Russia for exorcism. And this includes a consultation and private conversation with a priest called, and that is another priest here, he's called Father Gusev. He is a former dog handler and a musician who's now a priest. And he claims that he has performed 15,000 exorcisms over the last 25 years or so. That's almost 2 per day. That's pretty hard work.
2 per day?
Yeah.
And considering how much it costs even to apply to...
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Quite a decent living there that they can make out of it.
Yeah, he's quite a character, this Father Gusev. Apparently, he also fronts a rock band called The Exorcist.
Okay.
Seems legit, I think.
Marketing level 999.
Yes. Yeah, so this is on the rise in Russia at the moment. Exorcisms are very popular, and this is what happens in times of uncertainty and disinformation. People turn to this kind of bullshit in order to get some grip on reality, quote unquote, to get a sense of control in their everyday life. Obviously, it doesn't help at all, only creates more confusion. But somehow I don't think Putin minds that very much.
No, I don't think that either. Okay, speaking of control, there is a very widely discussed issue of underage children, or children under 16 at least, being exposed to social media and all kinds of exposures that we can list that seem to be affecting them badly. And a lot of people try to work out what to do about it. We see examples like Australia, where they put out an outright ban on social media for children under 16. And a lot of politicians are jumping on that bandwagon as well. So the United Kingdom, for example, is now moving closer to becoming the latest country to ban social media for children under 16. But while the politics of the protection of children are clear, because everyone wants to at least be seen as doing something, right? The science and practical reality is a lot more complex than that. And it's not me saying it. It's not even Ben Goldacre, the author of my favorite sentence that I think you'll find it's a bit more complicated than that. It's experts on the field that say that. So the whole thing came up again because last week, on the 21st of January, the House of Lords of the United Kingdom's Parliament voted decisively, 261 to 150, in favor of an amendment that would ban under 16s from social media platforms. The government, however, has signalled it will likely reject this amendment when the bill returns to the House of Commons. And instead, Technology Secretary Liz Kendall has launched a 3-month public consultation exploring a range of options: full bans, overnight curfews, restrictions on addictive features like infinite scrolling, and even raising the digital age of consent from 13 to 16. And the government is expected to respond by summer 2026, with any legislation likely taking effect by late next year, not earlier than that. So this momentum partly follows Australia's December 2025 ban that I mentioned, which removed 4.7 million underage accounts, demonstrating that enforcement is technically feasible, if imperfect, because it's...
You can go around it, right?
Yeah, that's a problem, and I'll discuss it a little bit further down. But the influential fact-checking organization Full Fact raised a crucial concern in a recent article. According to them, a blanket ban could push young people toward even more dangerous corners of the internet, or unregulated AI chatbots that wouldn't be covered by the legislation. More significantly, a large percentage of young people get their news from social media. A ban could undermine their ability to access information and form opinions. Let's not go into the discussion of whether that opinion is well-based or based on proper information, because that would lead far away. But that would be particularly troubling for 16 and 17-year-olds voting in the next election. So Full Fact worries that a ban becomes a substitute for the harder work. Proper regulation of tech companies, embedding media literacy into education, and addressing misinformation at its source. These are 3 things that would be crucial, and not only because young children could be protected with those steps, but it's not only the children that needs protection. It's everyone.
I was going to say, who's going to protect me?
Exactly. You're probably a little bit better equipped than most because of being a skeptic. So you're at least suspicious about stuff online because you're conscious about how people can deceive. But there is a researcher's perspective to take into account as well. So Emily Setti, who researches online harms to teenagers, offers another evidence-based concern on the columns of The Conversation. She argues that issues like bullying, racism, and body image anxiety existed long before social media. So these platforms amplify existing social problems. They don't create them. A ban treats the symptom, not the disease. So she points out that age verification, while theoretically sound, and you mentioned that earlier too, that is notoriously difficult to enforce. Because young people are adept at circumventing restrictions. We know that because every one of us knows a child who can do that.
That's who we turn to when we get in trouble.
Exactly.
Fix my computer. I don't know.
Exactly. And according to her, to Emily Setti, they'll move to less regulated platforms or misrepresent their age, which is easy to do because usually when you register, you have to state your age and they don't require you to provide proof. This could push teenage interactions underground, according to her, away from parents, educators, and support services who might help when things go wrong. Because if you're not letting them do, they're going to do it in the underground environment. And this expert opinion is in accordance with what Full Fact said. Critically, 40 children's charities jointly oppose blanket bans, warning that there is another concern. Vulnerable youth, those in unsupportive home environments, rural areas, or marginalized communities like LGBTQ+ teens, rely on social media for peer support and mental health resources. And a blanket ban severs those lifelines for these people. This is also something that needs to be considered. So, Setti's research reveals something policymakers should hear. Young people are not passive victims. They recognize social media's downside, Comparison culture, endless notifications, pressure to maintain an always-on presence. What they want isn't exclusion, they want education, they want support, they want adults they can trust to discuss digital challenges openly without fear of punishment. They want guidance, not secrecy. Well, they need guidance. They don't necessarily want it consciously. They would probably deny that need, but we should be considerate for them. And the bottom line is that complex social problems rarely yield to simple technological fixes. The UK government is right to take children's online safety seriously, but the evidence suggests that banning platforms treats a symptom while potentially creating new harms. Isolation of vulnerable populations, forced migration to unregulated spaces, and delayed digital literacy. So the solution, properly regulating platform design, embedding critical thinking in schools, rebuilding youth services and community spaces, is harder and slower than a ban, but it's likely to address the actual problem. So please, do the right thing.
Yeah, not easy.
No.
All right, so migrants. Everybody are against migrants, right?
Yeah, fucking migrants.
Yeah, we don't want them foreigners.
I used to be one.
Right.
I used to be one in the UK.
So this is a topic with a lot of misinformation also going on, of course. Prejudice and conspiracy theories, such as the Great Replacement Theory, where some unknown nefarious and secret powers are working to replace us Europeans with brown people. I don't know. There are a lot of things like that. But not so fast. Not everybody feels like this or are against migrants. There are exceptions. One example comes from Spain, where the socialist Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez has said that Spain needs migration to fill workforce gaps and to counteract an aging population, which would imperil pensions and the welfare state as such. The migration minister, Elma Saiz, I think that's how it's pronounced, has just presented the new plan. The government will this week approve a decree that will regularize 500,000 undocumented migrants. This would affect those living in Spain for at least 5 months and also have applied for international protection before 31st of December 2025. So if you haven't done that yet, then it's too late, I'm afraid. But it would also include the children of these applicants if they also live in Spain. And the application period for this, for the new thing, will open in April and continue to the end of June. So first you have to have applied for international protection. That's too late to do that now, but then you can apply to stay really on this new bill.
Wow.
Interestingly, this decree will not need to be passed in Parliament for some reason that I don't really understand, because that's politics and legal things. So, and that's important because the Socialist Coalition lacks majority there at the time, but they can do this anyway, apparently. There's another example of not seeing migrants as a terrible thing, and that is here in Sweden, where we often hear politicians, and you hear me talk about it, but you hear politicians on a national level saying that we need to limit immigration and we need to facilitate for people to go home, quote unquote. And there's been a big program implemented just now in January to give people money to go back home, quote unquote. But 2 researchers at Linköping University, they conducted a new survey, which they sent out to all the Swedish local municipalities or communes. Sweden is divided into 290 communes. That's the lowest level of geographical.
So you're a communist country, basically.
No, we are a country of communes.
You're a country of communes. You're a communist country.
No, we're not. Okay, but the result is interesting because more than 1 in 3 of those communes, they replied that they have both the right conditions and the need to receive more new arrivals. Only 2% of the communes are of the opinion that receiving immigrants is a negative thing. 2% of them. The positive effects are given as positive demographic trends. We're an aging population, as most in Europe. We have older and older people. So getting young people into the commune, that's a good thing. Also, we need the skills of these people. We need the competence. And it's good both for the private sectors and the public sectors. There are also positive ethical and social aspects, they say, the communes, and economic growth. So case in point, just as examples, over 50% of the nursing assistants in Swedish homes for the elderly and 40% of licensed doctors and dentists are now foreign-born, if we call it that. They're not born in Sweden. And we need them. I mean, I need my doctor. Can't send them home. The researchers also say that the Swedish business community has criticized the government's migration policy for a long time, and they feel that the policy are negative for the Swedish economy and for the competitiveness of Swedish companies. So I think that's interesting. That's a perspective you don't hear a lot about. Communities that are welcoming immigrants. We hear a lot about the other terrible stuff.
Yeah, and I think it has a lot to do with what agenda a certain country's government has and what the narrative is. But that also stands for different news outlets as well. So, and for us, if you said that here in Hungary, you would probably get a really big backlash on that because people are trained to think that Sweden has basically fallen. So it's the Hungarian news outlets, the government-friendly news outlets, which are the overwhelming majority of news outlets here in Hungary. They try to convey that narrative of Sweden being an example of how immigration ruined the whole society.
Yes.
And the whole of the Swedish economy as well.
So we need. I just want to point out one thing. If you ask the person on the street, you would get a different story than what we got from the communes here. Because this survey was replied by officials working in the commune. People who see how the local community works and how it functions and have a sort of more educated view on things. But if you ask the man on the street, or woman, a lot of them would still be very much against immigration. But they are actually wrong. I think you can say that they are objectively wrong when they say that too much immigration has happened in Sweden and it's ruining our country. It hasn't.
And that's probably not the first time that occurs, that people off the street are wrong about stuff, and not the only topic on which that is the case.
Not the last one either.
Speaking of which, topics that we might be wrong on. Over the last few years, headlines have warned that our brains, hearts, placentas, and even testicles are riddled with microplastics. So recently, some doubt seemed to be surrounding these claims, suggesting that some of the most eye-catching studies behind those headlines may be wrong, or at least badly overstated, because of sloppy methods and possible contaminations. So where do we actually stand on the microplastics issue? The part that is not in doubt is that microplastics, which are tiny plastic fragments under 5 millimeters and even smaller nanoplastics, they are now everywhere in the environment, in oceans, soils, food, drinking water, and indoor air. People are exposed mainly by swallowing them in food and water and by breathing in airborne fibers, especially indoors. Studies have detected plastic particles using various methods in human stool, lung tissue, placenta, blood, and other samples. That tells us that some fraction of what we're exposed to does get into the body and stays there. It accumulates. The real controversy is about how much is getting in, where it ends up, and what harm it causes. The Guardian came out with an article that investigated a set of high-profile papers claiming surprisingly large amounts of micro and nanoplastics in places like the brain, arteries, and reproductive organs. Independent chemists have pointed out that many of these studies use an analytical method called pyrolysis gas chromatography mass spectrometry.
I was going to say that, yes.
Yeah, it's pretty cool actually, but it effectively burns the sample and looks at the chemical fragments and detects the certain chemicals that come out of that. So the problem with this is that fatty human tissues can produce breakdown products that look very similar to common plastics like polyethylene.
Turns out it's the other way around. The plastics is coming from us. This is we produce it in the body and then it leaks into the environment. Yes, I think so.
So we're shedding plastic that comes from our fat tissues.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Must be.
So if the tissue isn't fully cleaned, the instrument may see plastic where there is only fat. And that is basically a false positive result. Critics have also noted that some papers fail to run adequate blank controls, even though plastic contamination from lab air, equipment, or surgical theatres is very easy to introduce. On that basis, at least 7 widely reported organ studies have been formally challenged in the journals, and one review flagged another 18 papers that are not having properly considered these artifacts. Some of the most dramatic claims, for example, that an average human brain contains a mass of plastic equivalent to a plastic spoon, have been called biologically implausible by other experts, and rightly so. That does not mean there are no microplastics in our organs. I'd like to emphasize that. A number of groups have combined chemical analysis with imaging techniques such as electron microscopy and infrared spectroscopy to visualize particles in human tissues, including placenta and brain, which makes the detections harder to dismiss as pure measurement error. But even there, questions remain about exact amounts and how representative the samples are. So what about health effects? The most honest answer is the hazard is plausible, the mechanistic evidence is growing, but the human data are still very thin. And if you consider that, and you put it next to the amount of articles that have been published with the warning and with the claim that we are full of microplastics and we're all going to die because of it, it's a classic case of too soon. That, like claiming something too soon without the actual evidence being there to support the claims. Yeah, animal and cell studies show that micro and nanoplastics can cross biological barriers in rodents, accumulate in organs and trigger inflammation, oxidative stress, changes in the gut microbiome and reproductive harm, especially at higher doses. A recent rapid systematic review for policymakers in California, for example, which pooled human and animal data, concluded that microplastics are suspected to adversely affect digestive, reproductive, and respiratory systems and may be linked to colon and lung cancer. But almost all of that evidence comes from experimental models, not from solid human epidemiological data.
No.
So
we don't experiment on people very often.
You don't, but you don't necessarily have to experiment. You can accumulate data on actual cases and that you gather from measurements in bodily tissues as well, and not experimental models.
Of course, but we just said that these samples may be misleading.
Yeah. When it comes to everyday exposure from food and water, major public health bodies are noticeably more cautious. The World Health Organization's 2019 report on microplastics in drinking water and its 2022 follow-up on diet and inhalation both concluded that at the levels measured so far, microplastics in drinking water appear to pose a low concern to human health, while stressing that the evidence base is limited and better data are needed, especially for smaller particles. The European Food Safety Authority has similarly stated that because toxicity and toxicokinetic data are lacking, a proper human risk assessment isn't yet possible, and a new full risk assessment is only expected around 2027. A 2025 State of the Evidence review likewise judged the current consumer risk from microplastics to be relatively low, given that most particles don't appear to become bioavailable in large quantities, while highlighting big gaps in analytics and mechanisms. So the bottom line is, microplastics are ubiquitous in our environment and do enter our bodies, that's for sure. Experimental work gives credible reasons to suspect some health impacts, particularly for very small particles, but the size of that risk for ordinary people in Europe today is still unclear, and probably smaller than many other establishment environmental hazards. The science is moving fast, the analytical methods are improving, and some of the scariest headlines are likely to be revised, but this is exactly how good science and good skepticism should work. So the sensationalism that has been part of this argument against using plastics in general and trying to scare people because of it is probably a bit more complicated than that. So, yet another example of that to be the case.
All right, let's go to something lighter and a little bit silly, because I think we need
Go
that.
right ahead.
But this has some good points, actually, I think. And anyway, even if you may think it's silly to begin with, there was a man in Cannock Chase, north of Birmingham in England, who says he has seen Bigfoot there. Bigfoot, yeah. So Bigfoot has apparently swam over.
Came over from the US.
Yeah, took the plane or swam or ship or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's why they can't find him in the US. He's gone over to the UK. I didn't think of that. That's okay.
How long has he been living there?
Yeah, well, we don't know because it's anyway. So this is what I read on Yahoo News, because why not?
Why not?
Quote, a dad of 3 has reignited rumours of a British Bigfoot after he spotted a Sasquatch-type figure moving at speed through misty woodlands at Cannock Chase. So the dad, who chose to remain anonymous, can't imagine why, said he was walking along Castle Ring Hill Fort on the first day of this year when he noticed something strange out of the corner of his eye on what he described as a drizzly and misty day. So, corner of his eye, bad conditions for seeing clearly. Maybe that has something to do with it.
And probably the fact that it was the first day of the year, which is right after New Year's Eve, when people tend to, consume large amounts of alcohol, a result of which there might
we don't
be...
know. We don't know. He may be a teetotaler. Anyway, it goes on. I turned suddenly and thought, what the hell was that? As a large figure appeared out of nowhere, said the avid cyclist. So for some reason, it's important to say that he's a cyclist.
Yeah.
This happened a few yards next to me, but didn't feel scary, just strangely calm. My partner was 20 yards ahead, and she hadn't seen a thing. Our dog in between us didn't react either. There was no sound, no trace of anything, but I sensed and saw a broad, upright figure. It was probably 7 to 10 feet tall, moving at speed, probably around 15 miles per hour, and had light and dark flowing fur. Yeah. He also said it might have been a trick of the light. He thought that at first, but hang on. So I wasn't very convinced so far, but
he wasn't happy with the explanation.
No.
It was a trick of the light.
No.
So he decided to go for a more elaborate one. Okay,
yeah.
Nice.
But
Good thinking.
Here's where, it's obvious, but let me point it out anyway. This illustrates how the mind works for us all.
Yeah.
It's not special for him. For him, he's not crazy or something, but maybe he's not that used to critical thinking as some of us are. Then he turned to Google to find out if there was anything else behind that. And this is when he found out that this was not the first Bigfoot sighting in the area. 4 years ago, a self-proclaimed Bigfoot investigator, Lee Brickley, because being on the wrong continent doesn't stop you from being a Bigfoot investigator, I guess. But this
sooner or later, you're bound to see one, right?
But this Brickley guy, he claimed that he had discovered 41 centimeter claw marks in the forest, nearly twice of that of a man's size 8 hand. He also said that the footprint he discovered in the woods, because it was those as well, were the largest he had ever encountered. I was astounded, Brickley said at the time. I had never seen a footprint that large in my life, and it was clearly not made using a mold or a cast, end quote. Well, how he can be so sure about that, I don't know. But back to the guy, the dad, who had this recent sighting. At first, he almost dismissed it. He initially questioned what he had seen. We mentioned the trick of the light. But then when he learned about the other sighting, which for some reason, quote, could not have been made using a mold or a cast, end quote, he is now convinced. And he also can describe what he saw, how high the creature was, the color and the character of the fur. But at first it was just a shadow, right? So Yeah. So we shouldn't make fun of it. This is how the brain works. If you're not consciously educated to question what you see and what you think you see, it's easy to be convinced. And when you think that it has to be a Bigfoot, then you think about it for a week or so, and then suddenly you have a totally clear picture of this creature, even though at the time it was just something blurry that the dog even didn't see.
Give it a few months and a few more readings up on stories like that, and the creature will have a name and an actual address and everything as well.
Yeah,
so
I'm sure
fabrications work like that. I'm a little bit surprised, given the fact that it happened in the UK, that it wasn't the conclusion that it was a werewolf.
Could be. Deborah Hyde, where are you?
Where are you, Deborah? We need
she would have seen a werewolf, I'm sure.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much for that, Pontus. And that brings us to the end of the news round, which means we are moving on to finding out who's been really wrong lately.
Yes, we talked about, you mentioned the House of Lords before.
Yeah.
Ironically, the assisted dying bill in the UK is about to die. And that is due to the stupid House of Lords system. So we've talked about this assisted dying bill before and why we are for it and why it is a sensible thing to have. The bill, formerly known as, quote, the Terminally Ill Adults End of Life Bill, end quote, has passed the House of Commons, but a handful of members of the mostly unelected House of Lords are sabotaging the whole thing by dragging on the bill with hundreds of nonsensical suggested modifications to this bill. It's apparent what they're trying to do, and probably will succeed in doing. It is to delay the vote until the end of the parliamentary session, which is expected in May 2026, when it will be too late to pass it. So they are filibustering this. I don't know if that's a UK term or if it's just an American term, but it was used in the article as well. So filibuster is what they're doing, trying to delay it until it's too late. We have 7 of the most vocal opponents of the bill in the House of Lords. They have put together over 600 amendments between them. 600. And these amendments have included a pregnancy tests for all applicants, no exception for men, a 1-year holiday ban for applicants, so you can't be abroad for 1 year before you apply for terminating your life, and an unworkable requirement for half a dozen GP visits. 2 different amendments are calling for clinical trials of the substance to be used for the termination of life. How do you carry out a randomized control trial on a life-ending drug? Question for you, Andreas.
Well, there are pretty well-established life-ending drugs that are currently in use in some of the countries. Where
have they been randomized controlled trial? I don't know. Would you want to be a part of that trial? I don't think so.
My understanding is that some of them spilled over from veterinary.
Could be, but if it works for horses, it doesn't mean it works for humans. We don't know.
Well, some of the materials used in euthanasia for animals are the same that are, for example, used in capital punishment situations in the United States.
But police agree with me that it is hard to do this as a randomized control trial.
Of course it is. Yeah. So I do agree with the premise of, but yeah.
Right. And what I resent is that the vast majority of the members of the House of Lords are not elected. The vast majority are appointed for life.
Yeah.
And that's about 740 of them who are appointed for life. About 24 additional members are bishops. So they are there because of Jesus, right?
Lord Spiritual.
Yeah. And around 90 have inherited their seat, even if that's changing. It's on their way out. But there's still 90 of them there. So this is a total of 854 so-called lords. 7 of them can block important legislation just by dragging their feet, and I think that's unacceptable. So I feel that the whole system of the House of Lords should not be there, and that system gets this week's award for being really wrong. Please get rid of that and make yourself a proper democracy. Thank you.
Well, a bicameral system is not inherently wrong. There are other countries where it can work. But yeah, this system is flawed, is massively flawed.
Yeah, you can say it doesn't work at the moment anyway in America, but they have the Senate and the House, right? So yeah, you can have that, and there could be reasons for it, good reasons or bad reasons, but not elected people. Nah, I don't agree with that.
Yeah,
it gives too much power to random people. I don't think that should be allowed. Anyway, I've made my point.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And I understand that we have a word of the week. So, Pontus, please hit us with something interesting.
Yes, this is a word that I came across when I was doing this Russian story.
Oh, yeah.
So, the word is ochitka.
Ochitka.
Mm-hmm. So, you can probably guess what language it is.
It's Russian.
It is Russian, yes. If I understand it correctly, it can mean a reading through or a run through, especially in a theater or a performance, where it means reading a script aloud before you do the rehearsal. So that could be one meaning of the word. But in the context of today and our interest, it is also referring to an Orthodox exorcism ritual. So it refers to a specific prayer service performed over a person considered to be possessed. That's an ochitka.
Oh, ochitka.
Ochitka. Yeah, so there you go.
Haha. When I saw the script, I decided not to look it up.
Very good.
Interesting. It's a very interesting word. Anyhow, thank you very much for that, Pontus. And that brings us to the closing segment of every week's episode. So let's see what quote we have for this week. And this week's quote comes from someone who was a British astronomer and an astrophysicist who discovered the composition of stars and made quite a name for herself with it, even though it wasn't necessarily during her time, because there was a bit of a backlash at the beginning. So her name was Cecilia Helena Payne. And the quote is, "I was to blame for not having pressed my point. I had given into authority when I believed I was right. I note it here as a warning to the young. If you are sure of your facts, you should defend your position."
Yes, good.
But please make sure that you have the facts right first.
Yes. Don't be Swedenborg.
Don't be Swedenborg. Yeah, be very direct and be very strict when it comes to assessing your evidence and base your position on the evidence. But once you have it, once you're sure about it, stand up for it. Okay, but that really brings us to the end of this week's episode. I'd like to thank you, Pontus.
Thanks a lot.
Many, many thanks to our listeners as well for tuning in. Please keep doing so. And until next week, goodbye.
Hej då!
Vislat. This has been your ESP experience. The show is produced and recorded by TheESP.eu. Join us again next time, but until then, please send your feedback and comments to info@TheESP.eu. We would also love to hear your ideas and suggestions regarding topics, and if you have any skeptical news from any European country, we're always eager to hear about them. If you have an upcoming local event or an organization to promote, please don't hesitate to let us know, as we are more than happy to help. All music in the program was written and performed by Keisha J. Gray and George Robb and is used with their permission. Please check out our webpage for show notes and archive material at theesp.eu. Follow us on Blue Sky at theesp.bsky.social. Like us on Facebook or support our work on patreon.com/theesp. And don't forget to spread the word by sharing our content with others.
I don't know how you can believe.
Exorcism.
Exorcism. Yes.
But that would be particularly troubling for 16 and 17 years old. For 16 and 17 years old. For 16 and 17-year-olds, home environments or rural. I write it down and I can't pronounce it.
That will regularize. That's hard to say. I can't change it because that's
you've
what they
got
sound.
yours too that you cannot say.
I'll tell you if you
Ochitka?
if you
Ochitka?
if you just
So
introduce it.
are we doing this?
Yeah, we're doing it.
Okay.